Hello, friends around the world. I hope you are well, and welcome to the podcast, Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. Around the year 900, the Emperor Leon VI issued a set of regulations addressed to the prefect of the city, the Eparchos of Constantinople. This is a kind of mayor, though he's a member of the Senate. And it contained many regulations for the various craft guilds in Constantinople, or just various worker occupations. Some of these were organized in what we might loosely call guilds with memberships that were in charge of certain professions, making soap, making wax, that sort of thing. Some were more loosely understood, that is, masons and builders. That group doesn't seem to have had an association. But there is a set of regulations governing them. Now, as happens with all imperial regulations, these are presented to us as a top-down process. This is the emperor laying down the law about who has which rights in which context. And some of these check abuses that builders might have been perpetrating on their clients, the people who hired them to build something. But others also give builders the various procedures and mechanisms by which to escape being abused by their employers. Now, it is very difficult to know the story behind these regulations, that is, how they came to be. And as I mentioned, as is often the case with imperial pronouncements, the emperors always want to seem to be in charge, but the authorities always want to be in charge and to be seen as sort of laying down the law. And for a long time, or for the most part, we have tended to write history that way. Though there are often cases when we can pull back the curtain and see how some of these imperial pronouncements are produced, and they're often produced through a kind of petition system whereby an interested party or set of interests or quote, lobbying group will address the emperor and say, we have these concerns, this is what we want. And sometimes the emperor will write back saying, I hereby say, and then essentially quote what that group wanted or asked for, sometimes making modifications. It's very rare that we can gain these glimpses as to, how the pronouncement or the law or the decree or the decision was made. But it is very often the case, and it is very likely, that various lobbying groups had a say, or that there was a bargaining process that resulted in what we sometimes see as something that just issues out of the palace. What has not yet been studied that much is a degree to which organized groups representing labor had a say in those kinds of decisions. Now, there's some texts which suggest that they do. I will refer you, for example, to an inscription from the city of Sardis in Western Asia Minor, and this is from 459 AD. And it presents itself as an oath taken by members of a mason or builders corporation or guild in the city. And they are swearing to the defensor of the city. This is a quasi-imperial, quasi-local official entrusted with sort of curbing abuses and maintaining the enforcement of law in cities, also protecting the weak against the powerful. This is part of the legal charge of the defensor according to the laws. So they are swearing to the defensor that they will abide by a certain set of regulations governing their practice. And some of these check the abuses to which contractors and builders are sometimes liable, sort of stringing their clients along for weeks and months without completing the task. And so, for example, they swear to abide by a form of collective corporate insurance. In other words, if one member of the corporation who takes on a job can't finish it after a certain amount of time, the corporation or guild or whatever has to decide someone else will take this on. We don't know the process by which they decide this internally. So in other words, this inscription renders invisible the internal mechanisms of that organization of laborers. but they must have had one. Now, this kind of collective insurance is actually not an entirely bad thing for the members of the guild, right? For example, it converts into an internal corporate process what might otherwise become a civil lawsuit. But there are also regulations in this inscription that clearly seem to be coming from pressure from the corporation. In other words, if the contractor can't finish the job because he is ill, the employer, their client, cannot take action for like 20 days until that person recovers. And if he can't recover by then the job passes to someone else. Now, this document has also been read as a top-down sort of enforcement of even oppressive rules by, quote, power onto the workforce. But it seems to me, at least, to be the result of negotiations on all sides of this process. And generally, in our scholarship, I believe that there is still a lot of room for us to expand the range of agency that we're willing to attribute to labor, and in this particular case, and in many others I have found in sources, organized labor. Now, my guest today has walked boldly into that space with a new book that appeared just 2 days ago. She is Sarah Bond, professor of history at the University of Iowa, and the book is called Strike: Labor, Unions, and Resistance in the Roman Empire. Now, it tends to focus mostly on ancient Roman history, but it does go down into late antiquity, the period of antiquity from which we actually have sources, including the Sardis inscription. Now, Sarah Bond is an experienced historian when it comes to labor in antiquity. Her previous book was on disreputable professions in the in the Roman Mediterranean, and the main title is Trade and Taboo. But she is also a public intellectual representing the interests of the fields of classics and ancient history in our public discourse, not just through her blog, which is appropriately called History from Below, but also with many interventions in the public discourse, in mainstream media, major newspapers, and other outlets, both in print and online. Check out her regular contributions to the online site Hyperallergic, which deal with, in many cases, the modern reception of classical themes, ranging from the popular culture, the movie Gladiator 2, to Elon Musk's Nazi salutes, and so forth. Sarah does have opinions, which makes it very fun to speak with her, and also an ideal guest for a podcast. So I will stop here and let her speak for herself. Thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here is my conversation with Sarah Bond. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So I just interrupted you a moment ago. We were talking about the audio version of your book that's being recorded. So congrats on that too. And you were saying, so I was about to say, when you mentioned that, is it going to be a British man reading it, or maybe someone from the South? They can get the right Southern accent?
No, they hired a very well-known female voice actor. That's one of the things we really wanted. But because over the years, whenever I do podcasts, people tend to voice modulate me because I have a very high voice. As one student reviewer said, she's like Minnie Mouse, if Minnie Mouse knew a lot about the Roman Empire. And so there was never a discussion whether I would record the audiobook. It was just kind of assumed that we would hand this over to someone more trained and having a lower voice, because I tend to grate on the ears of especially British men who have written to me. When I recorded for the BBC, for instance, I got a lot of feedback that maybe perhaps I should become Margaret Thatcher and go get voice lessons to lower my voice down. And since that is not going to happen, we just decided that we would have a woman record it. But yes, we decided very much that we are not going to go with the traditional British man reading a Roman Empire tale.
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to lower your voice in the editing?
No, let's
I-
let's keep this authentic. I want people to know why I wrote a book instead of making a documentary about this.
All right. So not James Earl Jones for you.
No, no one's ever accused me of having a mellifluous voice. It's more my writing than my voice that people are looking for. So Ursula is never going to come to me with a contract.
Yeah. I think on this podcast I've had every type of voice frequency and timbre and there it is. And I actually think it's very important to hear people and how they sound and how they talk naturally. In fact, that was advice given to me by a professor at Michigan when I first went as an undergrad. He said, just go to the talks and just kind of listen to what they sound like, which I
Mm.
thought was the strangest thing at the time, but in retrospect, it's not like we can do very much about our voices. Yes, you can do training and sound like what was it, Margaret Thatcher?
Yes, she was told in Parliament, I think, that her voice was very grating on the ears of British men, and so I don't recommend ever being like Margaret Thatcher, but
Okay,
you do. There is a history that she went to voice lessons in order to get this like lower voice.
okay.
And of course, my advisor, Richard Talbert, who is a wonderful individual, his students fawn over him in part because he looks like John Cleese and he sounds like him.
Right.
And so the expectation when they went to discussion sections after having Richard give these beautiful talks about the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, then they would go to discussion section with me, and it was really a letdown for them. And I do not apologize for that, but I understand that they have been trained that the Cambridge British
Yep,
Roman
yep.
history voice is the voice that they expect.
Well, I remember when we at Ohio State when we would hire a colleague who was from the UK, we would jokingly tell them that they could expect a teaching award within the first couple of years. Like,
Mhm.
just and and it goes by field, right? So if you're in psychology or chemistry or something like that, a German accent will actually gain you points, but a Hispanic accent does will not. There's a whole politic. Oh, all the politics of accents, and anyway,
Yes, and I wrote an essay about this for Hyperallergic that people are welcome to look up, but it's about the history of why Romans have British accents
yes,
in film. And I think it's very interesting to see why we expect certain accents from certain people. And so,
yeah,
yes, I guess I would encourage people to just embrace this high voice and go with it for the next hour.
they will do that. They will. I have the data for it. So. Okay, let's get to the book, the print version. We'll wait for the audiobook. The listeners can go look that up when it comes out. So strike. Why don't you start off by telling us where our term strike comes from?
Well, as we'll talk about today, the act existed for far longer than the term we currently use in English. But that term was developed in 1768, and there were sailors at the port of Sunderland in England, and they struck down the topsails that are on the ships within the port. And so they could not sail out of port in order to carry various commercial goods. And so it was essentially brought to a standstill, and the sailors then levied their employers. They went and asked them for higher wages in return for getting the topsails back up and allowing the ships to go back out. And not long thereafter, only a few months thereafter, the sailors that were along the River Thames in London, they decided to do the same thing. So they replicated the same action and they struck the topsails so that the various ships along the Thames River could not sail. And so it became regularized within English during the course of the 18th and then 19th century into the period of the Industrial Revolution to call it a strike, but it's gone like a rose by any other name for many thousands of years. And so, even though we call it a strike, Romans at various times call it a cessatio. In Greek, we might have an anachoresis, which is a withdrawal. And
Mhm.
so, whether you're calling it a withdrawal, a cessation, a greve, a boycott in some instances, all of these things describe a similar action.
Yeah, so what's the earliest one that you have found, let's say in just sort of the Mediterranean world, the earliest case of workers who sort of refused to work as for leverage?
The one that we recognized, at least in the Mediterranean, because I want to say first off that I am a historian of the ancient Mediterranean and I have done a lot of work on global history, but this is my expertise. The earliest one that I could locate, and certainly working with Egyptologists as well to certify this, is 1157 or 1155 within the area of Deir al-Medina, which is a artisan and necropolis worker area in Egypt. And they are working under Ramesses III. And they're very upset because monetization with coinage has not happened yet. We think that at least within the area of the Mediterranean, that's about the 7th century into the 6th century BCE in the area of Lydia. But they are getting paid in kind. So they're getting paid in emmer, they're getting paid in wheat, they're getting paid in foodstuffs that sustain them. They live in this artisan area, and it seems like every few weeks, Ramesses is very late on getting them the emmer that he has promised them. And so they go eventually and sit in the back of a temple. And this becomes a long-term way into the period of the Ptolemies to refuse to work in order to collectively bargain to get higher wages, or their wages, if they're being paid in kind, would just mean more wheat, more regularity, a guarantee that they are going to be paid on time. And so, as a worker, the only way that they can really convince Ramesses that they need to do this is to stop work altogether as a group. And so they go on strike by sitting behind a temple. And sometimes in the Ptolemaic period, they sit inside the temple. And this is something that Siddha von Redden, who's a wonderful scholar, has talked a lot about, is anachronism as a very regularized act within Egypt.
Yes. Now, Egypt has its own, presents opportunities that are sometimes not available in other countries or lands, rather. And we can talk about those. In the more classical lands, it is difficult to access these kinds of events, which is not to say that they didn't happen, but they perhaps don't leave the same kind of documentation that they do in Egypt. And I see your book as an effort to try to survey ancient history, looking for traces of these kinds of actions and the groups that might have carried them out. But in general, why is it difficult to access this information from the more sort of classical literary sources that we have?
The questions that we ask influence the things that we choose to write down, the things that we care about, the things that we want to know more about. We oftentimes document. And the simple answer to this is that a lot of the historians that survive in the literary tradition, especially from Roman antiquity, are not focused on either the economy or day-to-day workers, something that we might call quotidian history or daily
Mhm.
life. That's seen as very vulgar and very basic. It's not something that people like Tacitus truly cared about. And you get glimpses of it through sources like Apuleius or Petronius, but the intent is not to give a daily record of what is going on from day to day. And strikes and the withholding of labor are seen very much as something that is part of the daily register of the city, rather than events that should be recorded for all of posterity to learn from, because the word historia, this questioning of the ancient world, really they're talking about what should we learn from philosophers, from the events of the military
Mhm.
world, and from politics. And so the questions and the concerns are shaping the documents that they make. And it's just very true that the historical record does not care about strikes. And so many of the pieces of literature that we have that show us this are accidental, indirect, showing us things like rebellion as well, but also many of them are papyri and inscriptions that reveal contracts that tell us that they cannot do X or they
Right.
cannot do Y. And so we have to work backwards and say, if they're adding a little portion into the contract that says you cannot take a cilia in a temple, what do we deduce from the fact that they no longer have the power of sanctuary? Because asilia is where we get the word asylum from. And if they aren't allowed to take asylum, they aren't allowed to take sanctuary in either a church or a temple, what are they so scared about? And so a lot of the reading of these sources is reading against the grain to say, hey, maybe the asilia is being taken away as it was in the Ptolemaic period, because workers would take the chance to sit in temples and churches so that they would not be dragged out and brought back to work if they collectively acted as a group.
Yes. So in the earlier part of the book, you have some cases that did make it into the literary record, as the plebs in Rome, those famous incidents, right, described by Livy. That's like Livy handing it to you on a plate. But for the rest of the book, what you just called reading against the grain is exactly right. And so I went back and read it again with this in mind. It's, you know what it's like? It reminded me a little bit of like searching for life on other planets, where you know you're not going to find it, but what you're looking for are the traces that it leaves from which you can infer that it must be there. So specifically in your case, I, I got the sense that you were finding two kinds of things. First, groups organized labor organized in some way or another on the one hand, and the second, agreements about what can and can't be done. And it's very likely that both of those things involved, very broadly speaking, negotiations, but those negotiations often involve some sort of leverage, and leverage for workers is basically not working. And that those agreements are the result of, coerced negotiation on both sides. But we don't see that, right? They don't have narratives of how they came to this agreement. That's the problem. But I think it's perfectly right. And in fact, we have to infer what's reasonable from the traces that we have. So before we talk about those groups and what they might have been doing, let's tackle the sort of elephant in the room, is the question of anachronism, because you do so in the introduction. And is it anachronistic to refer to strikes in the ancient world, particularly the Greco-Roman world? I mean, you obviously don't think so. You use the term strategic anachronism, though. So why would it be anachronistic, or why do some people think it's anachronistic to use that terminology? And then maybe we can talk about whether it is or not.
Oftentimes, strikes are at the behest of more organized labor unions. And so I am anticipating with this book that a lot of the pushback or accusations of anachronism, because I've spoken to many people about Collegia over the
Hmm.
years, will be because I call some of these associations, because there were, well, we have evidence for about 3,200 associations, and that is just a drop in the bucket. It's probably a very small percentage of the ones that actually existed. But the associative fabric of the Mediterranean underpinned the economy, but it also underpinned everything: the social life, the feasting life, the religious life. Every person, in all likelihood, had a group, whether informal or formal, that they belonged to, just like we do. I mean, we belong, at least I do, to the SCSAIA, but I contain multitudes, and I also belong to the AHA, and I belong to the AAH, and every other
Yeah.
society that you want. But uh, there are lots of different memberships within the ancient world as well. And these inscriptions were discovered at the end of the 19th century and published by a very beautifully haired man named Theodore Mommsen. And for those that are listening to this, you need to Google Theodore in order to know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to ruin the surprise for you.
Okay.
But when he publishes the CIL, which is a gigantic corpus of inscriptions, people begin to learn about these associations, many of them called Collegia, that people didn't know very much about. They are mentioned, but they just didn't have a lot of evidence for. And those collegia are cast by many in the 19th and early 20th century as simply there for drinking clubs and feasting. And later on, wonderful economic historians like Ramsay MacMullen believed that they were predominantly for feasting. And he specifically wrote, I want to say it's about a 5-page article, but maybe it's 6, on strikes in the ancient world and how they could not have existed. And his belief is simply that these collegia were not economically powerful enough, and they didn't have the agency to come together and really take away their labor and have any real effect on the Roman economy. And I say Ramsay's name because he's no longer with us, but I very much respect and loved that he was one of those people who wrote about collegia early on, and wrote about strikes when very few people ever have. And I think that part of this is just saying that it is not an anachronism to use a modern term to describe an action that humans have been doing since at least 1157 BCE.
Yeah.
But the labor union one is very difficult for people because we use the term to specifically refer to those groups that came together and formulated as a product of the Industrial Revolution. And so if the Industrial Revolution has not happened yet, the belief among many labor historians is you cannot label a collegium, a societas, a thiasos, anything you want to call an association as a labor union. And so for many years, in the Roman world, we have called them voluntary associations. And if they are enslaved persons, then we call them involuntary associations. But that to me creates this false disconnect between modern labor history and ancient labor history. And the person that really resolved that for me about why comparative history is important is Orlando Patterson. And I think that that is the case for many people when they read in 1982, the year of my birth, they read Slavery and Social Death. He looked at 66 different slavery systems. And he cross-compared them over time and space. And he had lunch. I believe it's lunch and coffee. And John Bodell, who is a wonderful historian at Brown, will say more about this. But Moses Finley went to coffee with Orlando Patterson, and they argued. And they were very much talking about this idea of the primitive economy that Moses Finley believed in. This idea that these are just people drinking in collegia. They're not, going on strike. They are not aware of the economy, and thus this is very much a primitive world that they're living within. And I think Orlando Patterson, even though he's talking about slavery and not the Roman economy writ large in terms of the arguments that we would have later, Orlando Patterson, who is still with us and is emeritus at Harvard, knew that bringing labor historians together to talk about slavery was the only way that we were going to see the continuities and differences between a sector of the Roman economy and labor history. And I think the same thing with strikes is that if we break down the semantic barriers and we understand that they are there, but we begin to say, okay, a factio can function as a labor union, or we say that a building association in Sardis can function in a way that is similar to labor unions, then we take away the stigma of primitivism completely. So I am against the primitive view of the economy, and I am also against the primitive view of the ancient world. And so I think that doing away with these semantic barriers can help us to better work together and speak together. And I want to go to more conferences with modern labor historians where we're in consultation with each other.
Yes, and conversely, I mean, I agree with that. And conversely, there are this host of assumptions and expectations that prevent us from seeing things that might have been there. And Ramsay MacMullen is a great historian, and I learned a lot from him. But whenever any historian is making the following kind of argument that this is less interesting than you might think, right? Or nothing to see here, folks, move along with this kind of defensive, it's like I'm arguing against a position that no one's actually making, but what I'm seeing in the sources kind of speaks to it. So I want to head it off before anything, really dangerous happens. That to me is like an alarm that oh no, not you need to look there, right? Especially in the study of Roman history, which is, well, you mentioned Moms in the late 19th century, a very conservative field that was, operated by some very conservative men in a bunch of empires. When I don't think that the idea of collective labor action was something that they, were particularly uh, either aware of yet or at least sympathetic toward. And I don't think they wanted it in the Roman Empire. I mean, there's also a kind of sense that, these societies are run by their elites and, workers do as they're told. I mean, that's right. I just find it implausible that you would have all of these groups organized around um, occupations in one way or another, and all they're doing is drinking and arranging to bury each other. Like
It's it's
it's
such a
implausible.
simplistic view.
Yeah.
You're not allowing to see people in the round because we always say that, oh, modern people contain multitudes. Yeah, so did ancient people. They contain
Yeah,
multitudes
yeah.
as well. They have marriages, they have children, but they also have work that they care about. They have their artisans, their carpenters, their textile workers, their fullers, who are people who are essentially dry cleaning clothes with urine, which is a whole different topic that I love. But you've got all these groups of people and they know their worth. And so when you go into a dialogue today and people are telling you, oh, they just aren't cognizant of X or they just aren't
Mhm.
cognizant of Y. I mean, we already mentioned before that I am a Southerner from Appalachia. And people oftentimes do not think that poor people or Southerners who are also poor are capable of the same things that people at elite universities or in elite, very wealthy parts of the country are. There seems to be a belief that just because you don't have money doesn't mean that you don't, just because you are poor doesn't mean that you cannot think for yourself and that you don't know how to strategically function on a day-to-day basis. And that there's a chapter in the book on Clodius and the tavern keepers. These are called tabernii. And people meeting in taverns and inns in order to hatch plans has happened
Mhm.
forever.
Mhm.
Even if you don't have an official scola, that is to say, a clubhouse to come to, you can go to a tavern or a bar in order to get together with your group and say, hey, we think that our foreman or the person that is overseeing our group is not giving us fair wages. We need to renegotiate the contract. And if we don't renegotiate that contract, or they refuse to, then we will withhold our work. And that's why you get legislation, to my mind, under the Julio Claudians that stop hot meat from being sold at taverns, right? So part of reading against the grain as a legal historian is, why would you want to stop hot meat from being sold in a tavern? Why would you want to stop, say, alcohol from being sold? Well, nobody wants to go to a tavern if you don't have alcohol and food to their minds. And so sometimes we have legislation that is getting at the capabilities of these regular people and their everyday lives. And we have to be fiction writers in a sense to fill in the gaps, which
Yeah.
ancient historians always had been. It's just that the fictions that most ancient historians wrote in the 19th and early 20th century was saying that these are just regular people who like to bury the dead and drink together, and they are not doing any kind of regularized economic activity.
Yeah. Or at any rate, I mean, they're engaged in economic activity and so, but they're not engaged in changing the structural parameters of that
Right.
activity.
They
Yeah.
are beholden to the structures from above that
Yes,
are being
yes,
set for them,
that's
and
it.
they never have any agency from below. And so part of history from below in this movement that really took steam in the world of history after the Bolshevik Rebellion in particular was that there is power from below. And I don't think it's anachronism to say that I believe that workers in the ancient world had more abstract understanding of their capabilities than we give them credit
Yeah.
for.
You mentioned the Sardis inscription earlier. This is from 459 in Sardis, Western Asia Minor, which we'll talk about later. It stipulates conditions of labor. And I just remembered yesterday, actually, there is, but I tried to find it, but I couldn't in the little time that I had. There's a document from 14th century, somewhere in Macedonia, related to Mount Athos, which is a document that documents the working conditions of builders, I think, for the monasteries of Mount Athos. And there's things like you can't ask them to work on the weekend and things like this. It doesn't say, I think, why any of this happened. But when you have something like that, you have to, as you said, use your imagination to fill in the narrative, like what is going on here. I wish I,
How did they get these days off? And the
yeah, yeah,
weekend is a product of the Industrial Revolution. This idea, Saturday, of course, is actually the product of the Industrial Revolution. Sunday is the product of Constantine
yeah,
reserving the day of the sun. But workers fought for the Saturday and for the Sunday
yes,
to come together to have a work stoppage that they did not have to go to work on those days. And then in England, they also added Mondays, which is why a lot of the shops that we still go to are closed on Mondays, sometimes restaurants and
yeah,
various shops. And so this really is something that you bargain for. It's not something that employers are just going to give you. And so asking yourself in the 14th century, why did they get a couple of days off? Do you think that it's just the beneficence of the
right,
employer?
right,
No, they had to have lobbied in some way.
yeah,
And the question is, did they lobby as a formal group, as an informal group? But all
right.
of this is speaking from a silence that's very hard to
So you mentioned
wrap.
the groups. Tell us a little bit about these associations in the early Roman Empire, that what you call the Collegia. Like very broadly speaking, how are they organized? Give us a couple of examples of them, just so that the audience has some kind of relatively concrete picture in their head.
Right. You can form a group just like today for almost any reason, but a lot of people in the ancient world formulated them around the trades that they practiced. But we also had religious groups, for instance, that are oftentimes clustering around a certain deity, around a certain practice, that are also oftentimes called collegia. Almost every association in the ancient world, though, has a religious element to it. So if you are a smith, for instance, you may be worshiping Hephaestus, right? You may have various deities that are your patron deity, and even with early Christ followers that we later call Christians, they form collegia. Jews form synagogae, right? And so under Roman law, they tend to oftentimes be called, in a blanket term, collegia or societates, which is where we get the word society from, for
Mm.
instance. And so we have these thousands of various groups that begin to really increase in number after the death of Alexander the Great. After Alexander, this Hellenistic period, it really proliferates in the Eastern Mediterranean, that people are creating more and more groups for them to be within. And so in a world where there's very fractured politics, but also an increase in trade within the Mediterranean, they
Hmm.
need to have something to facilitate this trade, but also to facilitate things like the theater circuit. So one of my favorite groups to talk about are the Technetai of Dionysus. And these are very high level actors and actresses that are on a festival circuit that really develops during the period of these Hellenistic kings, and they're traveling from place to place, and they begin to create riders. And the one thing that I slipped into the book that I did not get removed was mention of the most famous artistic writer of all time, which is, of course, the Eminems of Van Halen. That Van Halen used to include on their writer, that is to say, the document that is sent to every person before they arrive, that they would have a stipulation, I think, for brown M&Ms, and I'm sure your listeners will correct me if I get the color wrong. But you knew that the people, when you arrived, had not read your contract and your writer very closely, and so you should look at the stage
Ah,
setup
right,
because Van Halen had a lot of pyrotechnics. And so if you did not set up properly, you
right.
could tell that the canary in the coal mine was the M&Ms. And the Technotai of Dionysus also have riders that they send ahead to the person that's hosting them for a dramatic festival. Perhaps they're doing an Aeschylus piece, maybe a little Sophocles, maybe they have some dance, etc. And these troops are dramatic troops, but they have an archive and they have a clubhouse. And they decide the terms of their agreements because they have popular support behind them. Just like
Hmm.
today, actors and actresses leverage their social capital.
Right.
And so the Technotai are leveraging their social capital, getting better contracts than all the other actors and actresses within the Mediterranean because they're in high demand. And so what do we call these Technotai? Well, I call them a labor union because they are functioning in the same way that SAG-AFTRA functions for writers, screenwriters, actresses today. But the Technotai are one group. They're a very elite group. But there are also, for instance, construction workers. There are textile workers. Pompeii has dozens of collegia. Ostia, that is the port that is right near Rome, they have tons of collegia. And just from Ostia alone, we know that 40% of the men at Ostia appear to have had membership in an occupational collegia or a religious one.
Right.
So having a group identity is very important in a very large imperial world. When you live in a world run by autocrats, where do you turn for status and for friendship and for economic support as well? Oftentimes, and as somebody who admittedly comes from a union family, my grandfather, who was from West Virginia and was in a coal mining union, where do you turn to? You turn to your union. You turn to your collegium for status and for feeling like a person in a world that has 60 million people in it. And I mean world as in the Mediterranean, not the entirety of the world at the time. I'm talking the Roman Empire at its height probably had around 60 million people.
Yeah. And it's important to note this, that we might think in conjunction with the term labor union about sort of fundamentals of work conditions such as pay, work hours, time off, and so forth. But it also includes the M&Ms. Like the demands that a group can have depends on their particular occupation and what they need. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something economically structural, but anything does fall under this category of collective action by these groups. And I think it's interesting that you flesh it out with, there are groups that are more obviously in the Roman Empire necessary for the imperial economy, and that the Roman authorities will well, the Roman authorities were sort of notoriously suspicious of any kind of group on the grounds of political sedition. Now, you know, I don't know if you're builders in the city of whatever, but who knows? Um, but they needed them, right? And um, you have a number of episodes where the interests of these groups are threatened and they respond. Can you tell us a story about Paul in Ephesus, just to give a sense of, because this is a story that I think is a narrative of exactly what we're talking about.
Yes, I should say that this story occurs in Acts, and there's a lot of debate among early Christian scholars about whether Acts is a reality, whether the episodes that are being described are actually happening. And I think just like with the plebeians, if you can imagine a world wherein workers function in this way, then you are saying that they are capable of it. So while I don't believe that every episode within Acts may be a one-to-one of what actually happened, this episode occurs, we think, between about 53 and 55 CE. So we're talking about the middle of the first century CE in the city of Ephesus that has a very large temple called the Temple of Artemis. And just like today, and just like your previous guest, Maggie Popkin, talked about, souvenirs are the underpinning of any kind of economy within a place that has large tourist sites. So whether that be Delphi, whether it be Rome, whether it be Ephesus, the silversmiths are selling little tchotchkes that are very important to them making a profit. And we get a lot of the mention of them in a collective form, which is how many collegia are referred to, just silversmiths. And these silversmiths are very upset because Paul has traveled to their city and given a sermon essentially that says, please stop buying these tchotchkes. It is going towards the goddess Artemis and turn towards a monotheistic Christ following belief that he is encouraging. And so he's there to proselytize about Christ. He's there along with two other assistants who we'll get to in just a second in order to encourage the people of Ephesus to turn towards the teaching of Christ. But that means they turn away from Artemis, and that is not good for business. And so we have the silversmiths actually chasing Gaius and Aristarchus, who are the followers of Paul, because Paul very wisely just kind of stays out of the fray and he's like, whoa, I'm not going to do this. But these two followers are chased into the theater that we still know exists within Ephesus. You can still go to it. And the doors are essentially closed behind them. And we have the silversmiths apparently being the catalyst for people getting together in the theater to yell at these two guys. How did this happen so quickly? How did this come about? And my belief is that the silversmiths are a collegium formally that have a group within Ephesus, and they have sent the word out to all their members like, let's go, it's go time. We got to have a talk with these guys. And as someone who previously worked in Sicily, it's not going to be a nice talk. It's going to be a talk that encourages you sort of to do exactly as they wish. And so they threaten him. And we have a secretary, a scribe, who says, you know, guys, we're all getting together in this theater. And I'm just putting out the warning here before any Roman officials or soldiers get here that this might be against the law, because as you said before, Roman law says that large groups coming together in theaters and especially collegia that are meeting without the proper paperwork and license that was given are at least capable of causing riots and violence that then the Roman Empire justifies as necessary to disband them. And so I think that scribe actually works for the silversmiths, and that he's telling them, yo, guys, after we threaten them, let's all disperse and get out of here because the Roman authorities are going to show up, just like in Monty Python when they're having that discussion of whether they belong to the people's front of Judea or the Judeans' people's front. Those are all collegia, and they're sitting in a theater having a conversation about their resistance to Rome. And so I can ding Monty Python on small things, but let's face it, Life of Brian tells us a ton about collegia that I think actually occurred. It's probably the best collegia movie that we have outside of Agora, which we will talk about.
Yeah, the scribe is for me like a procedures oversight guy, you know, who's like, hey,
he's HR or
yes,
something,
he's
he's telling us.
Yeah, I know you want to have a word with these guys, but keep in mind, you know what I find so interesting about um, that episode is whether it's real or imagined by the author of Acts. Like either it doesn't matter. Paul is not causing, let's say, a slump in the sales of statues in real time that they can measure, right? it's not like their measurable sales are being impacted and they're looking for the source of the problem. No, they are inferring what might happen downstream if many people accept Paul's message. This is our threat to our market. This is our threat to our product. Like, it's a systemic way of thinking. The way in which um, a corporation today will like not want its product to be advertised in a depressing show,
Yes.
right?
And I
Um,
think we can see parallels to, for instance, Tiberius's response to the Jews, that Romans in general don't like evangelism towards monotheism. And Tiberius throws out, he throws out various pantomimes for disorder. We have, for instance, Claudius ejecting Jews out of the city, and this feeling as though you have more loyalty to your collegium or your synagogue than you do to the Roman
right,
powers that be. It's a very dangerous thing to Romans. And one thing the book really grapples with is when a law says no collegium can exist in X or Y without a license, how stringently is this actually enforced? Because
right,
we have a lot of evidence that collegia continue to proliferate, even when Roman legislation says that they cannot meet at night or that they can only meet one day per month, right? All of these rules, we all know we don't follow legislation to the T, right? There are a lot of people in states that don't allow, for instance, the smoking of marijuana, and they still smoke marijuana. And so just because a law exists doesn't mean people follow it. So
or,
yeah,
I mean, in many cases, I think these laws are for selective enforcement. That is, it's an option. The authorities are giving themselves an option. They don't intend to enforce this 100% of the time. But when you need to get to interfere or intervene, this gives you a range of options to do so. I think that's
yeah.
largely what.
And I think universities, if I could be so bold, do something similar with freedom of assembly now, especially
Yes.
private universities, is
Yeah.
that you always want to have that card. You want to have your ace that you hold against you, and you're like, you know what? We just don't allow any groups at night.
Right.
But you, even if you're targeting one group,
Yeah.
you can just clean the whole board. And this happens in 59 in Pompeii, is that there is a riot that is very destructive after a fight in the amphitheater. And immediately we have the Senate deciding, you know what? Just get rid of all the Collegia. So you throw the baby out with the bathwater and then you don't worry about it. Like,
Yeah.
why even particularize which collegium it's going to be? Just be like, no groups, except for the groups that are integral to the functioning of the Roman supply chain.
Right.
So we've got bakers, for instance, that are called pistores in Latin are called pistores. And then you've got very important fabri, who are construction workers and carpenters, for instance. So certain groups get to exist. And even when there are sweeps of legislation that try and clean them out, they continue to function. But increasingly into the period of late antiquity, the state brings them closer and closer into the fold
Right.
by making them what we would call today public entities rather than private collegia. And
Yeah.
so the reach of surveillance, the reach of control in terms of supply chains increases from about Septimius Severus forward.
Yes, this is a major theme in the book, the increasing regimentation by the state of many of these kinds of groups that it deemed, what today we would call sort of essential workers or essential services that the state required for its expanded operations in the later period. Before we talk about that, tell us about the provisions of the Sardis inscription, which you mentioned earlier. These were quite fascinating. I mean, I don't know how I read this about a decade ago or so, and I couldn't believe what I was actually reading, but it does say that. So yeah, what's going on? This is 459 AD in Sardis.
Right. So we're in the middle of the fifth century, and this again is one of those documents that is a contract. And so we are reading a contract in a way that it was probably never meant to be in terms of trying to recreate a historical event. But what we have within the Sardis inscription is the statement of an oath and a agreement that construction workers that are currently working on a construction project, that for instance, if certain workers get sick, that the group, that the society that is supplying all of these builders, these fabri, are going to send new ones within a certain number of days, right? So if you call out sick too regularly, you will be replaced on the workforce, for instance. That they are giving over provisions for their workday, for their wages, for the oath that they need to take in order to bind them to this contract. So not just having this contract signed, but also taking an oath that they will uphold it. And
Right.
part of that is that they are not allowed to engage in what we would call a work stoppage or a strike, essentially.
Right.
And so I think that this Sardis inscription, which has been looked at many times over the years, but especially in the 1950s, when the new labor movement within the United States was really gaining steam, really was, as it was depicted in the 1950s, a document that shows us that there was a fear within the people contracting labor that people would go on strike and that they would walk off the job, especially at construction sites. And I think anybody who has had a refurb in their house or has
Hmm.
had their house built knows that you are beholden to construction workers because they do something extremely particular that you cannot do.
Right.
And oftentimes civic entities in particular, they contract with these construction workers in order to build structures, and they want them on a certain timeline. They want it to be finished at a certain point. And that's also what the document is looking at as well, is like, will you finish your work on time? Can you guarantee it, etc.? All of the things you'd want in the building of a structure. And so I think that it gives us some insight into the anxieties and fears, which means there must be some reality that strikes and with the withholding of labor is happening. And especially in Asia Minor, workers seem to know their worth because we have a lot of evidence, particularly from Asia Minor, that this happened, such as the Ephesian silversmiths that we just talked about.
Right. And this is a part of a broader trend in late antiquity of the state, as I said, regimenting a lot of these groups. Another one was the ships that deliver grain from Egypt, heavily regulated with laws in the Theodosian Code. This Sardis inscription didn't make it into the law codes. We have it; it's carved on stone, and it was probably a local arrangement. But you can see these arrangements in two ways. You can see them in lots of ways, but the two poles that I sort of oscillate between, and they're complementary, these are not either or, is that on the one hand, the 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 market, well, the state, or the authorities, the political authorities are ensuring that the work will be done, right? And at the same time, they are kind of forcing a collective insurance plan on the occupational group in general. But that I think also benefits the group. This is not just the state dictating its terms, because they're spreading the pain of, say, a ship going down, which is, the insurance for the ship, or of you're ill and you can't go build that wall today, and there that there's someone else in this group, right, that will step in. But the thing is that this inscription doesn't tell us, nor is its purpose to tell us. It doesn't mean that these things don't exist. The collective agreements among the workers on how they divide the costs of these kinds of events, right? Which surely they had. It's not as if, like who's going to step in? Who decides who steps in? There's a group that decides this, right? So almost a kind of like a health insurance or anyway. And they sort of cut both ways in a way. There's something for both sides of the agreement. I don't think it's unilateral. And yeah, who knows what kinds of actions prompted this in the first place?
Yes, we can only try and think about the things that might have incited this document to come about. And so I think part of the reason the book goes for 1,000 years is not just because, okay, we don't have a ton of evidence every single day for strikes. That's one thing. But because the book is looking at changes in labor and collective action over time, that it takes a long durée history to figure out by the time we get to the 5th century, what is the evidence we have for these types of contracts? And comparing them back to the Ptolemaic
Right.
contracts is the best way that we can unpack through comparative history why this document even exists. And so you have to, because there's such small pieces of evidence that you're kind of weaving together and creating links between, that's a very dangerous practice as a historian for sure. But also it's the only way that we can look at something that we were never intended to be told in the first place. And so, yes, I think these documents are very interesting. But we also, for instance, have coloni, who many people translate this word as peasants, but they're just lower level farmers in areas like North Africa. They're sending petitions to the emperor
Hmm.
in the 2nd century, and they're banding together as farmers and saying, we're going to leave this imperial estate altogether if you don't start treating us better.
Yeah.
So collective action comes in so many forms on a spectrum from extremely standardized writer for artists all the way to just people who are like, you know what, we're gonna walk off this job and we're gonna send a letter saying that we're gonna do that to the emperor. And that is something I think really powerful to say that maybe one individual colonus doesn't have that much power, but the colony together, if they walked off the imperial states, there would be no grain for these ships to be loaded with. And then the ships couldn't go to the port. And then the port couldn't go down the Tiber. The barges couldn't go from the port down the Tiber to Rome to bring bread. And so I think part of this is that during COVID, I thought a lot about how fragile supply chains are. And I don't think that they were less fragile in the ancient world. And so having a strike muck up these economic engines and workflows, you can have one strike and it really messes up how things actually function on a much larger level. And we've already seen that in the modern world today, that even small events in one canal can have reverberations economically that are global.
That Yes, and that's an excellent place to leave this, I think. We had a number of other questions that we wanted to talk about, but I think we're sort of out of time. And I think that was just a wonderful link between the experience of many of these groups in antiquity, where, life was certainly more fragile and precarious, and what a global pandemic revealed to us. Not that it wasn't there before, but it pulled the curtain aside a little bit, and we saw it. And you mentioned we were going to talk about the movie Agora. I don't know, maybe we'll do another episode on movies about the ancient world or something like that.
I
That would be
just want to do a whole episode on funeral workers because I love them. I love a good corpse carrier. I love a fossor. I love the
I-
Parabolani, who are Alexandrian hospital workers, but also corpse carriers as well. But let's do one day just on ancient movies and or movies that are set in the ancient world. But I do love a funeral worker because they become extremely, extremely important to the church during the period of the rise of early Christianity, because you
Interesting.
need someone to bury someone properly so that they get resurrected properly.
I will do some background reading on funeral workers then, and I'll be in touch about that. By the way, when during COVID in 2020, we had I think I'd done an episode with some historian. Who was it? Was it Kyle and Tina? I can't remember now exactly. Where I posed a question: if COVID had happened in the Roman Empire, would anyone have noticed? And one of the two of them, I don't remember which one, said, "Yeah, funeral workers would have, noticed."
Tina loves funeral workers a lot. I'm gonna guess, but
Like,
also Kyle. I mean, I actually I can't say that, but I wrote an article for the Journal of Late Antiquity looking at a bunch of these collegia of funeral workers. And I would say for anybody who's listening, if you go to the catacombs in Rome one day, you will see that for the first time, we have the celebration of funerary workers in a way that Romans prior to Christianity really didn't appreciate them very much, and they were very stigmatized. But within Christianity,
all
we
right,
have the celebration of fossores, that is to say, diggers. And so you can see these beautiful painted frescoes of fossores in clerical garb over top of the loculi within catacombs in Rome. And it's beautiful to see workers celebrated. And yes, Damasus is the one that is largely doing this, and we will talk about Damasus another
okay,
time. But seeing workers celebrated and actually depicted in a way that they weren't prior is pretty great.
agreed, agreed. And thank you for your book also. I have to say, when I came to the U.S. from a sort of traditional European leftist background, I found the configuration of American sort of leftist concerns to be odd because I came with the idea that it's really like 90% labor unions, 10% empire. Like those are your concerns. And I found zero concern about labor unions, some about empire, and a lot about like identity and things like this. And it was weird. It was disorienting to me. And I'm still no, you need labor unions. Like most of your problems here can be solved with labor unions, but that's not anyway. We have a Supreme Court that's designed to break labor unions. That's what it is. And anyway,
And it's
whatever.
only going to increase in the next
Yeah.
4 years.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, different topic.
Yes.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming on and for writing the book. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I loved it. Thank you.